Let's get more on this now from Peter Alexander. He's a lecturer in global food security at the University of Edinburgh. Good to have you back with us, Doctor. This really is a perfect storm we're seeing at the moment, isn't it? Because even before this war in Ukraine, the world was suffering from a serious issue of food insecurity. And now we've got the world's breadbaskets of both Russia and Ukraine being severely hampered in terms of its delivery of food to the rest of the world. Is there an easy fix for this? We know the G7 nations have pledged about $4.5 billion, but is that enough considering the scale of the problem?
Yeah, thanks. You're quite right. The scale of the problem is quite daunting and challenging. And I think your piece was very good in laying out, where this is occurring and how sort of systemic it is, if you like. But I think also that it was quite good to sort of indicate that it's about choices, if you want. And we have enough food in the world. It's just it's not affordable by everybody, and therefore we're seeing the harms that you portrayed so clearly. So it's about how we choose to allocate that food, if you want, through economic and political and international trade. And if you like, the richer people, the richer countries in the world have choices to make there about how much subsidies, how much aid is provided to sort of deal with the worst of those situations. However, obviously we saw WFP people in your piece sort of saying that the sort of implying or even stating that the full kind of weight of these issues lie with the conflict in Ukraine, and yes, that's certainly not helping, and it's part of that perfect storm. But it isn't the whole part of that perfect storm. We saw malnourishment increasing through the COVID pandemic, and although historically it's been reducing through time, there were still hundreds of millions of people who were malnourished prior to that war. So it definitely is contributing, but it certainly isn't the whole story either.
Yes, and as you say, there is such a stark difference between this food security situations in, say, Western countries versus the rest of the world. In the West, we're seeing a lot of food go to waste on a daily basis. You say that this excess needs to be addressed and this issue of distribution needs to be addressed, but how do you go about doing that logistically?
Yeah, I mean, obviously diets, if you like, in the food system in wealthier countries has a number of issues. You mentioned food waste, and that's certainly one. But obviously there's an obesity epidemic, which I've sometimes framed as a food waste problem. We're consuming more than you require for nutritional purposes. But also, we eat too much meat, which requires animal feed to be produced and consumed by those animals, and that's a fairly inefficient way of producing food from a nutritional perspective, and it has therefore large consequences for sustainability in terms of greenhouse gas emissions and biodiversity loss. But also it means that a lot of the food that we're producing globally isn't necessarily going to feeding people because of that inefficiency. It's going to feeding animals, which then feed people, but fewer mouths are fed through in that way, with greater environmental consequences. And again, to come back to your perfect storm comment, we haven't mentioned climate change, which is making it more difficult in many parts of the world to produce the food as efficiently as before, and that's likely to increase if we are unable to sort of mitigate those greenhouse gas emissions to sort of stop the worst of that climate change occurring. So there are things occurring on different timeframes within the system. So, we have shocks such as the Ukraine war, which is kind of short term, if you want, occurring very quickly. And then we have the longer term trends such as climate change, which are also playing into some of these issues.
Certainly no easy fixes, but I guess you do have to start somewhere, don't you? Peter Alexander, always a pleasure. Thanks again for joining us.